The US Commerce Secretary has warned that some US businesses now view China as uninvestable. Gina Raimondo was speaking during a visit to Beijing aimed at improving strained relations between the world's two biggest economies. She says US firms might cease operating in China without prompt action to improve the business environment. The two countries are engaged in a trade dispute that's seen them impose restrictions on each other's exporters. Well, let's get more on this from our correspondent in Taipei, Tsou Tzung-Han. I asked him why US businesses might now consider China uninvestable.
That is mainly because it has become highly risky for the U.S. companies to invest in China, especially after Beijing revised a law earlier this year to counter spy activities. Many foreign businesses now afraid of being targeted by the Chinese government since updated definition of espionage is very vague. And also, Beijing recently raided several consultancy companies from the U.S., detaining local staff and imposing heavy fines. This prompted foreign companies to reconsider whether it is a wise decision to do business in China. But the Chinese embassy in Washington has debunked the remark, saying that most U.S. firms in China wanted to stay, and Beijing was working to further ease market access to foreign companies.
Right, so is this problem specific to American companies, or are companies all over the world, particularly, I suppose, in Europe, also finding investment in China difficult now?
Well, it's definitely a common problem faced by Western companies and those considered one of the U.S. allies. For example, if we look at Asia, if not Western, Japanese firms have also already expressed fears about continuing their business in China, with at least 17 nationals being detained under China's anti-espionage law since 2014. And needless to say, the EU, as one of China's biggest sources of foreign investment, is also sounding the alarm. Its ambassador to China has commented on Beijing's recent crackdown on foreign consultancies and declared that it was not good news. So it becomes more and more common for companies in different countries to express the same situations.
Tsou Tzung-Han in Taipei for us there. Well, during her Chinese visit, Secretary Raimondo has also insisted that the US does not want to decouple itself from China. I've been speaking to author and China analyst Fraser Howie. I asked him if you can take that claim at face value.
Well, yeah, of course you can. I think, China is the world's second largest economy. It's a huge part of global trade. If the idea of decoupling means a complete split where there is simply no interaction, a la sort of a huge North Korea, then that clearly isn't going to happen. America does realize, and certainly the Biden administration realizes, that you need to be engaged with China on a whole host of issues. That trade isn't going to stop, but simply that trade it's not simply going to be an open door, and that China can just come along, ignore either WTO provision, or just basically take a whole host of technologies which it's funneling into its military system to basically threaten the US and threaten the US allies in the area. So from that perspective, it isn't business as usual, or it hasn't a business as it's been in the past. But the idea that decoupling means a complete break with China and no engagement was always nonsensical and was always presented in an extremist view, simply to sort of to try and do nothing about China, frankly.
The US has made it quite clear, and President Biden's made it quite clear that it sees China as a competitor and it wants to compete with China. But Beijing's actually accused the US of, actively trying to hold the Chinese economy back. Now, is that a fair claim?
Well, not really. Remember, China, or the Americans, have bought trillions of dollars worth of goods from China over the decades, invested vast amounts of money in China. So that's a very strange way to be holding China back. This is basically a very common bleating from the Chinese Communist Party, saying that they're being encircled, they're being held back, life is unfair. And yet they refuse to look at their own actions, which have been very detrimental to bilateral relations with America and with other trading partners. And they've certainly made foreigners a target of a lot of their measures. So it's not necessarily fair at all.
So where next in this relationship between the US and China? Because China clearly has its own economic problems back home, and you've talked about how the US is not looking to decouple from China entirely, but relations still remain strained. So where should we be seeing this relationship go in the coming years? Are they going to get closer together? Are they going to repair these rough relations now, or are they going to deteriorate further?
Well, look, I think it's going to remain very strained. It's as simple as that. It's going to remain very strained because Xi Jinping has made no secret about his China goal, his China dream, this rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which requires a very high degree of self-sufficiency. He has made no rollback at all about using force to take over Taiwan. And he sees these as great goals of his presidency or his leadership as general secretary of the Communist Party. So from that perspective, China isn't really changing. And both of those policies are very much counter to where the US would want to see the Asia Pacific region develop, as do many of its allies. So things will continue to remain strained. I think we had got used to, the past 2 or 3 decades of growing trade relationships, growing investment, in both ways, growing bilateral investment, and that's simply not going to continue. It's going to be a strained relationship, much more focus on whether high-tech products are going to be allowed, much greater suspicion on both parties. And that's going to be a much harder relationship to manage. But I think it's almost the natural outcome of ultimately two systems which are, frankly, at loggerheads.
Okay, Fraser Howie, it's always interesting to get your insights. Thank you so much for joining us on DW Business.